Since I uploaded the video of me supposedly reading Touching from a Distance's choice as the greatest poem of the 20th century a couple of days ago, I've received a lot of feedback. Chief among that feedback is the idea that I should abandon film criticism and devote all my time to the reading of novelty rap lyrics in an English accent. Now, whilst that will of course always be the dream, I think it's prudent to keep film criticism as something to fall back on. The second strand of feedback that we've received is that we've been inundated with two requests that I upload a serious, non-funny video about a serious, non-funny bit of verse that will actually be Touching from a Distance's true contribution to what is, in the US at least, National Poetry Month. So this is it. This is the non-funny video. You'll be able to tell it apart from the funny video because when you get to the end of this one, you'll look down and your sides will be miraculously unsplit. The poem I've chosen is not, in fact, a poem at all. It's just a brief snatch of verse from a verse novel. When you say the words verse novel, the book that everyone immediately thinks of is Pushkin's Eugene Onegin. Now, while the book that I'm thinking of owes an enormous debt to Onegin, it can certainly stand on its own. The book is Vikram Seth, The Golden Gate, and it's so long since I read it that I can't actually locate my copy. So I'm going to have to do this from memory, but that's fine because memory is where all the most important poetry lives anyway. To set the scene, as I recall it, one of the main characters, a man, has just made love to a woman, and he's now looking down at her asleep and thinking about her. It's the kind of situation that must have inspired more poems than pretty much any other kind of situation in human history, and pretty much all of those poems should never have been written. They'll all be, I'm sure, absolutely diabolical. That's because looking down at someone you've just made love to as they fall asleep is the kind of situation that inspires a lot of poetry, but about which it's virtually impossible to write poetry that isn't tremendously trite and incurably cliched. Despite that, Vikram Seth takes that situation and manages to make something astonishingly fresh. What he says is this: "She lies asleep, unswiftly breathing. Her thoughts are not with him, her dreams traverse the solitary streams of inward lands, yet her hair, wreathing the pillow in a mesh of light, returns him to the fugitive night." Now, I think that's pretty much perfect. What I love most about it is the extraordinary precision of the language. Mark Twain said that the difference between the right word and the wrong word was the difference between lightning and a lightning bug being what some of us, particularly those of us here in the UK, would call a firefly. Now, Vikram Seth is a guy who's produced a lot of words. He's perhaps most famous for having written An Unsuitable Boy, which is itself perhaps most famous for being the longest novel in the English language. So Seth is a guy who is not afraid to throw about masses and masses of words. And yet what's extraordinary about him is that each of those words is a lightning bolt, and none of them is a lightning bug. To stretch that analogy slightly further, I think that the passage I've just recalled is one of the brightest passages that he has written. It starts off in a very low-key way, and we don't really expect that we're going to get this tremendously beautiful, I'm tempted to say unique piece of verse that follows. It starts off, "She lies asleep." Now, aside from that being in the present tense, that could pretty much be a line from any novel ever written, really. She lies asleep. It's totally unremarkable. And then suddenly we come up against something we don't expect. We come up against a word we've never heard before. She lies asleep, unswiftly breathing. Unswiftly. That, of course, isn't actually a word. Vikram Seth has essentially invented it. And that trick of taking and putting it in front of a word that does exist to make a sort of negative version of that word is, as Alan Bennett would point out, a trick that Seth learned from Larkin and that Larkin learned from Hardy. What's amazing about Seth's choice to use it here is that there are so many other words he could have chosen. We could all think of dozens, I'm sure, of words to describe someone who's falling asleep, particularly someone we've just made love to who's falling asleep. She could be softly breathing, sweetly breathing, gently breathing, rhythmically breathing. There are so many words that Seth could have used, and yet he knew that each and every one of those words that is available in the English language was the lightning bug. None of them was the lightning bolt. The lightning bolt was this word unswiftly. So she lies asleep, unswiftly breathing. What's marvellous now is that pretty much every poet in history would have then talked about the man looking at the woman and the man's thoughts, and yet Seth switches immediately to the woman's thoughts, which, again with that kind of negative unness, are distinctly unromantic. She's not thinking of him. Her thoughts are not with him. Her thoughts are not with him. Her dreams traverse the solitary streams. And if you think of all the words that have been written about and indeed wasted on dreams, trying to record dreams, trying to describe the dream state, and then you imagine that, you imagine that Vikram Seth has brilliantly, in 5 or 6 words, really just in 2, Inward Lands, summed up what it is to dream. It's to traverse the solitary streams of inward lands. Then we move on to this wonderful image, her hair wreathing the pillow in a mesh of light. It's the kind of thing that we would expect to be described in a poem, and yet it's totally fresh. Her wreathing the pillow in a mesh of light. From that we kind of know what the pillow looks like, we kind of know what her hair looks like, we know kind of what the window in the room is like because we know the light's coming through it. And it gives us a very strong mental image. And what's interesting is it does it with very few words. It's an image that he doesn't completely paint himself. It borrows perhaps from films we've seen, it borrows from our own experience, and yet it's really, truly vivid. She lies asleep, unswiftly breathing. Her thoughts are not with him. Her dreams traverse the solitary streams of inward lands. Yet her hair, wreathing the pillow in a mesh of light, now here comes my favourite bit, returns him to the fugitive night. The phrase fugitive night is just marvellous. It means, of course, the night itself is fugitive. It is running away. It's going round onto the other side of the world, and it's going to be replaced by day. It also, of course, describes the night that the man and the woman have spent together, the time they spent making love, which has already ended. Though that experience is already memory for the man. He's looking down, thinking about her, and he wants this moment. He wants to be able to remember this forever. And yet the moments that he really wants to relive, the moments of making love to her, have already gone. They're in the past. They will be forever be fugitives. He'll never be able to regain them. So I think that's just the absolute most perfect phrase Seth could have ended on. Now, although I've picked a highlight from that novel, the novel is full of passages like that. And so I hope what I've done in reading this and giving you my thoughts on it is to persuade you in National Poetry Month, and indeed in any month, to go out and find a copy of Vikram Seth, The Golden Gate, and buy it and take it home and keep it. I hope the second thing I've prompted you to do is that once you've got a copy of Vikram Seth's Golden Gate, you take better care of it than I obviously have with mine.